Thousands of U.S. trade unionists rally in Philadelphia, calling for a workers' Bill of Rights. But are America's politicians even listening? And will the labor movement have any clout this November? You're watching Inside Story US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Britansi. This weekend's rally showed that the trade union movement can still mobilize. Thousands turned out calling for improved employment rights. But less than 3 months before the 2012 election, the unions are arguably weaker than they've ever been. Last year, there were wide-scale protests in Wisconsin when the Republican governor, Scott Walker, tried to remove collective bargaining rights. This culminated in a union-backed recall election, which Walker won. Many other states are proposing similar legislation. Union membership has declined dramatically, and their influence on the Democratic leadership has waned despite their immense financial importance to the party. President Obama has failed to implement the Employee Free Choice Act, which would have made it easy for all workers to join a union. Significantly, the trade unions are not sponsoring any events at next month's Democratic National Convention in North Carolina, which is awash in corporate funding. So the movement seems to be in the doldrums just at a time when the economy is faltering and unemployment is high. And that's causing some trade unionists to call for a fundamental change of tactics. Many argue they should align with the Occupy movement, which brought thousands of protesters to the streets around the world. However, so far, such outreach has been dismissed by some other activists as an attempt to co-opt a movement for real change on behalf of a corporate-led Democratic Party. So, is the U.S. trade union movement in crisis? To discuss this, we're joined by Thea Lee from the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, the AFL-CIO. Also in the studio, Chris Townsend, who is Political Action Director for the United Electrical Workers Union. And from Philadelphia, we're joined by Thomas Sugrue, who is Professor of History and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. Thea Lee, we're told that what we saw in Philadelphia over the weekend, and indeed the lack of events at the Democratic National Convention, is all part of this new strategy. And in fact, what's happening at the DNC isn't simply because they chose such an anti-union state to have their convention in. Could you tell us a bit more about that then?
Sure. Well, there was a great event in Philadelphia on Saturday, Workers Stand for America. We had about 40,000 workers out declaring their independence. And really the point is to say that that workers and the middle class have been ignored by the political system. And so people signed, and they're still signing online. You can go to the website, workersstandforamerica.com, and sign an America's Second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights. And so it's all about the basic economic rights that every American deserves, the right to a voice at work, to full electoral participation, to a healthy and safe workplace, and a quality education. And
but does this mean that Democrats will get the automatic endorsement of the AFL-CIO no matter what they do? Or do they actually have to live up to some of these?
Well, I think every politician has to live up to certainly the Bill of Rights in order to get the endorsement. The AFL-CIO has endorsed President Obama, and he spoke by video to the rally in
Actually, we have a portion of that. Let's play that now. Here's that message that President Obama prepared for that rally in Philadelphia.
There's nothing more important to our economy and this country than making sure we have a strong and growing middle class so that anyone who's willing to work hard can get ahead. That doesn't just mean having a job. It means having a good job that pays a decent wage. It means having a voice in your government, starting with access to the polls. It means having a say at work, including the fundamental right to collectively bargain. It means being able to send your kids to great schools and to keep your family healthy. That's the way to grow our economy, by investing in the workers who made this country what it is today.
Christopher Townsend, do you get the sense that there is any credibility gap there when you hear President Obama say that, or is that enough? Does that calm you? Does that reassure you?
It's not very reassuring, but it's also in the context of what we're facing in the November election. In other words, we've got two candidates here No question from the standpoint of working people that this current administration has been far less than what it needed to be or could have been in terms of its actual vigorous representation or defense of working people in this climate that we've been in. But that said, we're facing now a Republican ticket of Romney and Ryan that has just declared outright its intention to liquidate us, completely destroy us as unions and as working people. So in my union, we don't have a problem separating the two. We're perfectly our facts are in order when we are critical of this administration, what it largely hasn't done, some of the things that it's increasingly doing that are anti-union, and recognizing some of the good things that they've done. But we're also not crazy or ambivalent to the fact that we have two now on the Republican ticket who have absolutely
right, but when these bills of rights are signed and the announcement is made, look, unless the Democrats live up to these ideals, we're not going to endorse them. The Democrats know very well that's quite hollow because of how right-wing the Republican Party have gone then, surely. So it's quite meaningless.
I don't think it's meaningless at all, because the point is, whether you're talking about the top of the ticket or the senators or the House of Representatives or governors or state legislatures, that in any race, I think working people and unions will decide how hard to work. So it's not just a question of endorsing. It's not a yes-no button. There are certain races where the AFL-CIO and our unions are going to work like crazy to elect people who have been real champions of working people, like Senator Sherrod Brown or Senator Debbie Stabenow. Those people have worked really hard, have stood with working people every step of the way. We will fight very hard for them. There are other Democrats who are a little bit lukewarm. They're not there when we need them. And those folks may find it a little bit harder to get folks out walking door to door, knocking, doing the phone banking that really wins elections.
But arguably, Professor Surgru, amongst those who were a bit lukewarm was President Obama and his White House itself then? I mean, did the unions really think he would use the financial crisis that was underway when he took power to fundamentally change the system as opposed to save the system, perhaps even enhance the system, and let alone attacking teachers' unions or not being terribly supportive of Wisconsin or hiring Jeff Immelt of General Electric as his job czar and so forth?
There was a great deal of hope when Obama was elected that he would be a staunch advocate for unions in the White House, and he had strong union backing in the 2008 race against John McCain. But the administration has been sometimes a fickle friend of organized labor. It also has faced the real headwinds of staunch anti-union politics among the Republicans, particularly in the aftermath of the 2010 midterm elections. And so one of the real struggles that the Obama administration has faced is how to push through pro-labor legislation when, for example, Obama administration NLRB appointees, National Labor Relations Board appointees, were held up by Republican blocs in Congress, or how to get the Employee Free Choice Act through when Republicans and just enough Democrats were not willing to stand behind it.
Well, that's the key,
so the obstacles of the Obama administration.
I mean,
it's really key.
Were the obstacles simply in the Republican Party? Isn't this fundamentally actually about the relationship between Labour and the Democrat Party, which has been in decline for some time? Actually, Professor, perhaps you can help us just in a potted history, trace that relationship between the Democrats and the unions and how it has declined. How has it actually happened?
Well, the Democratic Party allied with unions during the New Deal, during the Great Depression, when Franklin Roosevelt signed into law the National Labor Relations Act in 1935. It essentially put the federal government on the side of workers' rights to collective bargaining. But that relationship started to grow complicated after World War II when the Truman administration's veto of the Taft-Hartley Act, which restricted many of labor's organizing opportunities, was overrun by Congress. Over the course of the 1950s and 1960s, though, Democratic leaders and the union movement had a very close symbiotic relationship. One of Lyndon Johnson's closest advisors was Walter Reuther, the head of the United Automobile Workers. But big things started to change in the late 60s and early 1970s. American industry began to flee to low-wage regions in the United States and increasingly overseas to Mexico, to Asia, and the blue-collar base of the union movement began to decline. By the 1980s, the Reagan administration and congressional Republicans began to attack organized labor, particularly public workers. And then a really big electoral change happened, which is as union membership began to decline. And remember, in the 1950s, about a third of American workers were unionized. Today, it's about 11%. As union membership began to decline, politicians of both parties, Republican and Democrat, had fewer incentives to put labor on the front burner.
All right, on that point, on the decline in the union section, it might help if we put we always assume some graphs are going to help. So let's play some now. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, there were 14.8 million union members in the U.S. in 2011. That's the lowest number in 70 years, according for less than 12% of the workforce. The peak unionization rate was 35% and occurred during the mid-1950s. The Bureau says that median weekly earnings for union members are significantly higher, $938 per week. So there is that incentive compared to $729 per week for non-union workers. Okay, they weren't graphs, they were just sort of more, I don't know, actually, pictograms, I suppose. The point is, though, Kevin Drum, actually, the writer, says something quite interesting, Christopher Townsend, that it wasn't just those factors, there's also that social change, though. That there was a split between the new left of the 60s who were more interested in civil rights and anti-war issues and feminism and environmentalism, and that also led to some kind of ideological shift, perhaps, with the union leadership. Is that true, do you think?
Perhaps, but I think the greater explanation for why the rate of unionization and actual union membership continues to decline can be placed squarely on the front doorstep of the employers. Workers who try to form a union today are met with a ferocious assault, illegal, legal, multi-million-dollar, coercive, terrorizing type situation. I just returned from a campaign in Texas, a group of workers from the General Electric Company trying to form a union. I've never seen the kind of campaign, the sheer size, scope, terror that was unleashed on these workers. This is common. There's a reason why workers find it very difficult to join a union. It's because the employers make it very difficult. And that being said, this comes right back to the doorstep of the Democrats. We know where the Republicans stand. The Republicans are all in favor of union busting. But where do the Democrats stand as a group? It's very uneven. We have some who might tend to support organizing, don't like to be too loud about it, many who will keep quiet about it, and a few who don't. And this really is what goes back to the battle that we had or didn't have with the Employee Free Choice Act or the card check bill just a few years ago. And that remains one of those unmet pieces of business.
The battle you didn't have, as you say. Clearly, I mean, that's the other point then. You're faced with this virulent corporate and political hostility. But did the union leadership fight? Were they partly to blame? Did they allow themselves to be co-opted by the Democrat Party, who was increasingly getting more hostile?
No, we weren't co-opted, and we fought hard for the Employee Free Choice Act. We fought for many years. We put it on the table, even in the previous Congress where we didn't have much of a chance. We got co-sponsors. We kept a lot of pressure on both Republicans and Democrats to co-sponsor the Employee Free Choice Act. In the end, we're terribly disappointed, but I think you have a lot of factors coming together, and it's not fair to blame any one. It's not fair to blame President Obama entirely, because we didn't have 60 votes in the Senate to overcome the filibuster. And maybe our political system is messed up, and I would agree that it is, that we shouldn't need 60 votes to do anything in the U.S. Senate. But I think, we have a lot of things happening, a very severe economic crisis. And when times are tough, people are having a hard time figuring how we're going to get new and better labor laws that make it easier for workers to form a union. And that's a crucial thing. Yeah. And what you see, too, is that I think you see in the Republican Party and the very rich who have been so successful in getting more tax breaks for themselves, more rules to make their lives easier. In the last couple of years, they made a very calculated decision, which is if they destroyed what's left of unions, they could have the field all to themselves. And that was what this assault in Wisconsin and Ohio was all about. But you did see a backlash. You saw Americans coming together in Wisconsin and Ohio in defense of public sector unions. And that's a positive sign.
Professor Sturgery, was there ever a golden age, though, when the union leadership in the U.S. truly was fighting for progressive, systemic change, or is there a sense, this might be complete nonsense, but sometimes you wonder whether counterparts in the rest of the world were perhaps challenged the logic of capitalism a little more than the union leadership in the US. The union leadership here was always much more about working within the system. Perhaps they weren't prepared by just how ferocious late capitalism would become, because they've always they've always accepted the fundamental tenets of capitalism, which might not be necessarily true in Europe or elsewhere.
Well, one of the reasons that unions found themselves in this complicated position vis-a-vis capitalism and vis-a-vis the federal government was that during the 1940s, there was a systematic effort to purge the most radical voices from CIO and AFL unions. And so you had a shift in the center of gravity in those unions toward a more mainstream version of politics that differs significantly from trade unionism in, say, France or Britain, where many unions are still allied with the left, even with a left further than that which exists in the United States. But there are other reasons for unions. They built close working relationships with corporations, especially in major industries in the 1940s and 1950s, on what was called then the Treaty of Detroit, which extended over other industries. That is, corporations provided really good benefits, lots of security, retirement, and good wages in exchange for labor peace. And that concordance, that coming together of corporate interest and union interest for a time made unions in the United States a much less radical force than they were in other parts of the world.
And yet, I mean, the effect on the middle class has been striking over the years. There's that graph that I think has been doing the rounds perhaps for a year or so, clearly showing the correlation between union membership and middle class prosperity. Perhaps we can play that. It's quite a long animation, actually, so we might just keep talking over it. Which clearly shows, though, that as union membership falls, middle class prosperity falls as well. How is it then that the corporate wing of the Democrat Party and the corporations themselves then were able to present the unions as a brake on middle class expansion or prosperity? And that's very much part of the rhetoric that we're hearing today in the election.
I'll offer the employers, as they campaign in the political front, the same way as they campaign in the workplace, they're not constrained by the truth or the facts or anything else. They have an agenda that's very clear. It's a self-serving agenda. It enriches them when they succeed at our expense. They implement it. But one of the things I want to come back to is it was part of the discussion we had here about the what we used to refer to as the struggle for labor law reform, or in this most recent phase was known as the Employee Free Choice Act. This is this legislative mechanism that we need in order to be able to organize more effectively. Doesn't mean we'll be able to organize without resistance. It means we'll be able to organize better than we are today, which is almost a dead stop. And we have a situation where we should be clear. The labor movement across the board knocked itself out, did a fine job, a better job than I've ever seen in my 30-some years of proposing and being a proponent and making the case for this labor law reform. We had some Democrats who joined us. We had some, including the occupant in the White House, kind of fell down on the job as far as I'm concerned. There was a reluctance to take this up and really have the collision that needed to happen on that issue. And I'll bring it to this analogy. When you're at the Battle of Gettysburg, you need to take off your suit and tie and join the battle, and not try to stand on the sideline and be some sort of an arbitrator or worry about somehow some corporation, someone that I've picked for my jobs council wouldn't approve of this, the banks might not like it. You must get into the battle. I disagree.
I think you're being totally unfair, Chris.
I disagree.
And I think right now, we face a really stark choice, which is that the Republican Party has completely given up any pretense of caring about working people, about job creation, about economic growth, about building the future of the United States of America, whether it's infrastructure or education, the things that the United States cannot survive if we don't invest in our own infrastructure and in our own children. And yet we see the Republicans have only one thing to say, which is cut the budget deficit, cut the size of government. If they succeed, they shrink the size of government where government can't carry out its basic functions of taking care of the elderly, educating the children, building the roads, making sure the bridges don't fall into the rivers, then we are going to fail as a country. And Democrats are not perfect. I am the first to admit that Democrats are not perfect. We see a huge variety within the Democratic Party. Some corporate Democrats, some working class Democrats, some working class heroes within the Democratic Party. And so, you know, we struggle with that, but the contrast between the two parties is really stark.
But let's
right
look
now.
at the contrast then. I mean, if we look then at the funding of the parties, for example, or at least of the Democratic Party then, I mean there's a clear direction. Donations to Democrats from business-oriented political action committees, or PACs, has outstripped donations from union PACs. So according to the Center for Responsive Politics, for every $1 Democrats got from union PACs in the year 2000, they got $1.25 from business PACs. However, by 2010, Democrats got $2.55 from business PACs for every $1 they got from unions. Unions contributed about 40% of all money Democrats received from PACs during the election of 2000. But in 2010, union donations made up of just 24% of Democrats' PAC money. I mean, are we being too simplistic as we look at that and then see the lack of fight perhaps in the White House?
Well, we don't disagree.
Yeah.
We don't disagree. No, we don't disagree. But here's the political reality that we ought not to allow to escape us at this moment. This moment that we face as unions to try to mobilize our members in their own defense against this tremendous pathological anti-labor attack now falling on us all around, primarily from Republicans. This attack, this moment would have been much easier and much better for us to be able to handle had we had the kind of fight going back several years ago to that piece. The Employee Free Choice Act. We did not see anything like a struggle on the political front that labor needed, and labor did do a tremendous amount of work. So now we find ourselves with that battle never having been fought then, but we find ourselves today
and a different Democratic Party and a different Democratic Leadership Council. And how do you think the DLC or the DNC actually views unions? Sometimes you wonder whether they look at them, they also look at the unions perhaps as a brake on corporate expansion. Perhaps they genuinely believe that free trade agreements don't lead to a race to the bottom for union rights. They seem to be signing them with abandon. They seem to believe this is the way to prosperity, in which case you're not going to do terribly well.
I want to go back to the numbers.
Well,
that
part
you
of the
raised.
shift that's happened.
Professor, we'll come to you in just a second.
But I want to go to the numbers that you raised about corporate donations. And I absolutely agree with you. But the problem here is not that the Democratic Party got worse. It's that our electoral system got polluted by too much cash, too much corporate cash, too much. We have, you know, dramatic increase in inequality. That means that we have income concentrated at the very top, and that income is very focused.
Right, and partly, I mean, there's a correlation, at least in part, due to union membership.
And you have all sort of a vicious cycle of power and economic and political power concentrated at the top, and we have wrecked our political system by making it completely subject to money. And I agree that that has a bad influence on Democrats and Republicans alike, because you almost can't compete in a normal U.S. election without tons and tons of cash. And union members aren't going to bring the cash. We bring the bodies, we bring the power, we bring the energy and the grassroots mobilization, but we can't bring buckets of cash to the table, and we're never going to.
And yet in the media narrative, though, they say, well, the Republicans may have the Koch brothers, but the Democrats have the unions. But there doesn't seem to be much, maybe that equivalence. But Professor, what were you about to say?
What I was going to say is that there has been a shift in the power of labor, but that's also changed the composition of the Democratic Party. As membership in labor unions has gone down, labor power is concentrated now in a relative handful of states. Democratic politicians in large parts of the country don't need to pay attention to the demands of labor. Think, for example, about the state where the Democratic Convention is happening, North Carolina. It's got the lowest union density of any state in the country. As a Democrat running for elected office there, you don't need to pay attention to the demands of organized labor. And there are a lot of Democrats from around the United States now that don't have to listen or collaborate with unions in a way that they did.
Because the Democrats don't have any necessary ideological connection to workers' rights, I suppose. Is that the point?
Right. That's an overstatement, I think. I mean, Democrats are the party of the working family, and for the most part, I mean, almost every good thing that happens has come out of the Democratic Party. That doesn't mean the Democratic Party is perfect. I'm frustrated. I'm annoyed. I'm impatient with the Democratic Party every single day, but still, and all, it is the party of the working family. And to the extent, I mean, I think Democrats make a mistake.
We only have 30 seconds.
When they forget that.
Okay, well then, Christopher Townsend, very quickly then, what should the participation be for workers and unions in a system seemingly so skewed against workers' rights then?
Be aware, it is a rigged and corrupt system, profoundly rigged and profoundly corrupt. You have to participate in it to defend yourself, but you also need to join and build your union, because that's from where the good things flow, not from the generosity of politicians.
All right, Christopher Townsend, thank you very much. Thea Lee, thank you very much. Professor Thomas Sörgren, thank you very much too. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.